12-year-old boy finds a watch on the street worth millions. Selling it could change his life and his family's forever. But what he doesn't know is that the watch belongs to one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, Keanu Reeves. And what happens next will set off a chain of events no one could have ever expected. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The sun no longer shone with the same intensity. Its orange reflection dripped down the tall buildings of Los Angeles, tinting the streets with golden hues and stretching the shadows. Keanu Reeves walked without haste, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his eyes lost on the horizon. The city buzzed in the distance, but here, on this quieter street, time seemed to slow down. The lights of an old cafe began to flicker on. The neon sign blinked blue and red, reflecting on the asphalt. Keanu pushed the glass door open. The entrance bell chimed softly. Inside, everything felt suspended in time. Wooden walls, round tables, an old radio playing soft jazz. He made his way to the corner of the room and sat down unhurriedly. The waitress emerged from behind the counter, a cloth draped over her shoulder. "The usual?" He nodded with a small smile. Minutes later, the steaming coffee sat in front of him. He lifted the cup, but before taking a sip, his fingers slid over the watch on his wrist. The leather was worn, the metal scratched, but the dial still gleamed. He gently tightened the strap. An involuntary habit. His eyes settled on the window pane. The reflection returned his distant gaze, heavy with memories. He took a deep breath, drank the coffee, left a few bills on the table and stood up. The doorbell chimed once more as he stepped out into the evening. The breeze carried the last remnants of the day's warmth. He walked along the sidewalk, unaware. The watch clasp was loose, a longer stride. The strap slipped from his wrist. The watch fell silently onto the pavement. Keanu kept walking. He didn't look back. On the other side of the city, the sun sank slowly, painting the sky in an increasingly deep blue. In the small, open-door workshop, the scent of grease and oil filled the air. Daniel finished wiping his hands with an old rag. 12 years old, short for his age but quick. His father closed the toolbox, his face marked by exhaustion. "Lock up when you're done." "Okay." The man disappeared through the house door. Daniel leaned against the workbench, staring at the scattered spare parts. Dismantled engines, loose gears. He loved this. He liked understanding how things worked. But he never really had anything of his own. Outside, the street was beginning to fill with shadows. He grabbed his bike and set off. The bicycle pedal creaked softly as Daniel rode through the increasingly empty streets. The day was fading, and the streetlights began to glow, bathing the asphalt in a flickering yellow light. Then he saw something glimmer near the curb, a small metallic reflection under the dim light. He braked sharply, the bicycle tire skidding a few inches before stopping. He crouched, frowning. It was a watch. But not just any watch. Daniel carefully picked up the object and felt its weight in his hand. It was different. The leather strap, softened by time, contrasted with the stainless steel case. The domed glass reflected the streetlight. He turned it slowly, absorbing the details. His eyes widened. He knew this model. It couldn't be. With trembling hands, he pulled his favorite magazine from his backpack. Vintage Collection, Iconic Watches in History. The pages were worn, marked with notes and small circles drawn around the models he liked the most. He flipped through quickly, past the Omegas, the Pateks, until he found it. His heart raced. There it was. Rolex Daytona, Paul Newman. His gaze darted between the photo in the magazine and the watch in his hands. White dial with black subdials. Elegant red hands. The word, Daytona, engraved in red above the 6 o'clock subdial. Daniel held his breath. This watch wasn't just beautiful, it was a legend. The Paul Newman Daytona was one of the most coveted watches in the world, known for its rarity, and for being worn by the actor Paul Newman himself. Some pieces had sold for millions at auctions. He turned the watch over once more, feeling the hairs on his arms stand up. And then he saw the engraving on the back. "For Keanu, my love, never forget who you are." His stomach turned. Keanu. The name sounded familiar. He frowned, trying to remember. It was an uncommon name, but he had heard it before. He ran his fingers over the engraving, as if trying to absorb the story behind it. This watch wasn't just valuable, it meant something to someone. Someone who, at this very moment, was probably desperate for it. Daniel looked around. The street was empty. No sign of who might have lost it. He gripped the watch tighter. He knew exactly what he had in his hands. And now, he had to decide what to do. What would he do now? Daniel pedaled slowly, feeling the weight of the watch in his palm. The Rolex gleamed under the streetlights, a different kind of shine. The shine of something that didn't belong to his world. That thing was worth a fortune. It wasn't just money to pay a few bills. It was money to change their lives forever. His father's workshop would no longer have to survive on poorly paid repairs. His mother wouldn't have to count coins at the market, choosing between milk and bread. They could leave that cramped house, buy new clothes, never have to think about money again, never again see the tired look in his parents' eyes. The thought consumed him. He turned the watch between his fingers, observing the sophisticated details, the weight of the stainless steel, the classic dial. The watch wasn't just expensive, it was a golden ticket to a new life. And it was right there, in his hands. For a moment, he fastened the strap around his own wrist. The fit was perfect. His heart raced. He imagined walking into his father's workshop, opening his palm, and revealing the money. Dad, we'll never have to worry about money again. His mother would cry with relief. His father would be speechless. For the first time, they could breathe without fear of tomorrow. The thought made his head spin, but then, the clasp of the watch pressed against his skin, and a voice echoed in his mind. What isn't yours doesn't belong to you. His father's voice, firm, unwavering. Daniel took a deep breath. His eyes dropped to the engraving on the back. For Keanu, my love, never forget who you are. His stomach twisted. That watch had an owner, and that owner wasn't him. He stood there feeling the weight of the decision suffocating his chest. If he sold it, they would never have to worry about money again. They would never stay up at night discussing bills. But what if someone was desperately looking for it? What if there was a story behind this watch? He knew there was. The Rolex Daytona Paul Newman wasn't just a watch, and somehow he knew it belonged to someone who needed it back. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. The dilemma burned inside him. The feeling of freedom that money could bring. The guilt of knowing that money wasn't his. He took a deep breath and ripped the watch off his wrist, as if it burned his skin. Daniel held the watch between his fingers, trying to grasp the weight of his decision. Then he noticed something subtle on the inside of the leather strap. He frowned and tilted the watch under the streetlight. Engraved in tiny, almost imperceptible font was a phone number, an area code he didn't recognize. His heart pounded. If someone had that number engraved there, it meant this watch was more than just special. With slightly trembling hands, he pulled his phone from his pocket and typed in the numbers one by one. His thumb hovered over the call button. Should he? He swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and pressed call. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Daniel felt a knot in his throat. Then, on the other end of the line, a female voice answered, firm and alert. This is Rachel, who's calling? The watch felt even heavier in his hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What had he just done? The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Daniel held the phone tightly to his ear, feeling his heart beat faster with each ring. Then, the call was answered. This is Rachel, who's calling? The voice was firm but not harsh. Daniel licked his lips. I found a watch. On the other end of the line, the silence lasted only a second, but it felt much longer. What kind of watch? Her voice was sharper now. Daniel looked at the object in his hands. A Rolex Daytona Paul Newman, leather strap, white dial with black subdials. There's an engraving on the back. Rachel went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. What does it say? He ran his fingers over the cold metal and read aloud. For Keanu, my love, never forget who you are. On the other end of the line, Rachel let out a short breath. It wasn't just relief. It was as if something important had just been resolved. Where did you find it? On the ground, near a cafe. It was just there, in the middle of the street. Rachel was silent for a few seconds, as if trying to organize her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice sounded more personal, more direct. Daniel, this watch belongs to Keanu Reeves. He realized he lost it, and is very worried. Daniel felt the chill run up his spine. The name finally made sense. He had heard of Keanu Reeves before, the movies, the interviews, but he never imagined he would be holding something of his in his hands. Rachel continued, now trying to reassure him. I've been his personal assistant for years. When he realized the watch was missing, we went back to the cafe, retraced his steps, searched everywhere we could. Daniel looked at the Rolex in his hands again. He really wants the watch back. The way she said it carried a different weight. It was more than just an object. Daniel knew that. The silence stretched for a moment. Then, he took a deep breath and asked, How do I know you're telling the truth? Rachel let out a small chuckle on the other end, but not in a mocking way. You're smart, that's good. There was a faint noise in the background, as if she was moving. Listen, Keanu wants to meet you in person to thank you. He asked me to talk to you first, to make sure everything was handled the right way. Daniel frowned. He wants to see me? Yes. Rachel paused. But only if you're comfortable with it. Daniel's heart pounded. He never thought a lost watch would lead him to Keanu Reeves himself. He swallowed hard. Where? Rachel smiled on the other end. There's a diner on the corner of 8th and Main Street. It stays open late. Can we meet there? He took a deep breath, looked around as if searching for an answer. Finally he nodded to himself. Okay. Rachel waited a second before speaking. Her voice was softer now. Daniel, thank you, truly. He didn't reply, he just hung up. He stood still for a moment, listening to the sounds around him. Then he put the watch in his backpack, got on his bike, and pedaled toward the meeting that would change his life forever. Did you bring it? Daniel looked around before answering. Yes. Rachel noticed the hesitation in his eyes. It's okay, Keanu was already inside, he just wants to thank you. Daniel looked through the diner window, and there he was, Keanu Reeves, sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He wasn't looking at his phone. He didn't seem in a hurry. He was just waiting. Daniel's heart pounded harder. Rachel noticed. He's a good guy, come on. Daniel took a deep breath and stepped inside. The doorbell chimed as Daniel entered the diner. Keanu looked up and smiled. It wasn't a formal smile, it was genuine. Daniel felt a chill in his stomach. Rachel approached the table first. Here he is. Keanu nodded, his eyes now fully focused on Daniel. So, you found a watch? His voice was calm. Daniel just nodded. He opened his backpack and carefully pulled out the Rolex, placing it on the table. Keanu didn't pick it up immediately. He just looked at it for a moment. Then he ran his fingers over the cold metal, as if reuniting with something he thought he would never see again. He turned the watch over and saw the engraving. Took a deep breath. For a moment Daniel felt the weight of it for him. Then Keanu smiled. I thought I'd never see this again. Daniel didn't know what to say. He just shrugged. I just found it on the street. Keanu finally picked up the watch and fastened it around his wrist. The fit seemed perfect. He looked at Daniel. Thank you. And this time, his eyes carried more than words. Keanu picked up an envelope from the table and held it out to Daniel. I want you to have this. Daniel looked at the envelope confused. He took it slowly and opened it. His eyes widened. Inside was money, a lot of money, more than he had ever seen in his life. He swallowed hard. This is a lot of money. Keanu smiled. I know. Daniel felt his chest tighten. That could change his family's life forever. But something inside him hesitated. He looked at Rachel, then at Keanu. I don't know if I can accept this. Keanu rested his elbows on the table, intertwining his fingers. Why? Daniel felt his mind spin. Of course he wanted it, of course he needed it. But something inside him stopped him from just taking it and leaving. He took a deep breath and said the only thing he could think of. I didn't do this for money. Keanu was silent for a moment, then he gave a small smile. I know. And in that moment Daniel realized this was only the beginning. Daniel held the envelope tightly. Its weight felt much heavier than just money. He could feel the bills inside, the thick texture of the paper. But what truly weighed on him was the decision. He looked at Keanu, who watched him calmly, unhurried, as if he already knew exactly what was going through his mind. "This could pay all my family's bills," Daniel murmured, almost to himself. He wasn't used to holding so much money, nor to receiving something without having to fight for it. "It could," Keanu agreed. "But I don't want you to accept it just because you need it." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Keanu took a sip of his coffee before answering. "You thought about selling the watch, didn't you?" Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The air in the diner suddenly felt heavier. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't lie. Lowering his gaze to the envelope, he answered quietly, "Yes." Keanu didn't look surprised. He simply nodded, as if that response had been expected. "And why didn't you?" Daniel blinked a few times. The answer should be obvious. He did the right thing. But that wasn't the real reason. He took a deep breath. "Because I knew someone would miss it." Keanu smiled slightly. "That is something rare." Daniel looked at the envelope again. Part of him wanted to accept it, needed to accept it. But another part told him that it wasn't right. He bit his lip. I don't know if I can take this." Keanu leaned slightly forward. "Then don't." Daniel frowned. "But you want to give it to me." Keanu gave a small knowing smile. Daniel looked at the envelope again. Part of him wanted to accept it, needed to accept it. But another part told him that it wasn't right. He bit his lip. I don't know if I can take this." Keanu leaned slightly forward. "Then don't." Daniel frowned. "But you want to give it to me." Keanu gave a small knowing smile. Less than 10 minutes later, a car pulled up outside the diner. A man in a suit walked in, greeted Keanu, and handed him a different envelope. Keanu opened it and pulled out a document. He slid it across the table to Daniel. "If you want, you can start tomorrow." Daniel carefully picked up the paper. His eyes widened as he read the words. "Internship at the Los Angeles Institute of Engineering and Watchmaking. Training for young talents. Scholarship for the future." Daniel's heart pounded. He looked at Keanu, incredulous. This is real?" Keanu laughed. "You reminded me of something important today, that good deeds should be rewarded, but not with money, with opportunity." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He never imagined that by finding that watch on the street, he would end up sitting in a diner, being given a chance that would change everything. "This isn't charity," Keanu said, noticing the boy's expression. "It's an investment." Daniel clutched the paper in his hands. For the first time, he felt something greater than money, a future. Keanu smiled. "So, what do you say?" The next morning, Daniel woke up to an unusual sound, the steady hum of a strong engine. He got up, still drowsy, and peeked out the window. A black SUV was parked in front of his house. His father, still in pajamas, stood at the door, scratching his head as he looked at the car. Daniel felt his stomach turn. This is really happening. Before he could think of an excuse, the driver stepped out and walked up to the house. "Good morning, is Daniel here?" Daniel's father looked at his son, who was already standing at the door. "Do you have something to tell me, kid?" Daniel swallowed hard. He hadn't told his father anything yet. The driver opened the car door and looked at him. "Are you ready?" Daniel took a deep breath. He looked at his father, then at the car. This wasn't a dream, he nodded. "Yes." The ride was silent at first. Daniel stared out the window, watching the city pass by. He still didn't know exactly what to expect. The driver took roads he didn't recognize until they reached a more modern part of the city. Tall buildings, futuristic architecture, an environment that felt completely out of his reality. When the car stopped, Daniel saw Keanu Reeves waiting at the entrance. He stepped out slowly, trying to take in everything around him. Keanu smiled. "Welcome to the future." Daniel looked at the building behind him. The entrance had a large glass sign, Los Angeles Institute of Engineering and Watchmaking. His heart raced. "What is this place?" Keanu put his hands in his pockets. "A lab where some of the brightest minds work on the art of watchmaking." He pushed open the glass door and motioned for Daniel to enter. "If you want, you can start today." Daniel stepped inside, his eyes wide. Glass-walled rooms, workbenches filled with tiny tools. Engineers using magnifying glasses to work on parts so small they seemed invisible to the naked eye. He was fascinated. Keanu led him to a workstation where an engineer was adjusting the inner mechanisms of a watch. Every piece was placed with astonishing precision. Daniel stared, unblinking. "You like taking things apart," Keanu said, watching the boy's reaction. "But have you ever thought about creating?" Daniel didn't answer, because at that moment he realized he had. This was a world he wanted to explore. Keanu smiled at his expression. "If you want, you can start learning today." Daniel looked at his own hands. He had always fixed old, broken things. But now, he could build something that would last forever. His eyes lit up. "I want to." Keanu nodded, satisfied. "Then let's begin." In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Daniel split his time between his father's workshop and the lab. He learned about advanced mechanisms, precision, and high-quality engineering. Every day there was a new challenge, and he loved it. His father's workshop also began to grow. With Keanu's help, more customers started coming in, recommending the honest and meticulous work his father had always done. Money was no longer a problem. But more important than that, Daniel never again had to wonder, what if I had sold the watch? He knew he had made the right choice. One evening, Daniel was invited to a technology event. He arrived without knowing exactly what to expect, but in the middle of the elegant hall, he saw someone familiar. Keanu Reeves was there, chatting with a few people, with that same calm demeanor as always. He noticed Daniel and smiled. Walking up, he glanced at the boy's wrist. "So, still thinking about selling watches?" Daniel laughed. He raised his wrist, showing the watch he had built himself. "No, now I make them." Keanu nodded, satisfied. He had already known that would be the answer. Daniel never again had to wonder, what if I had sold it? The answer was all around him, in his father's workshop, in his mother's newfound peace, in his own journey that was only beginning. That day, he knew he had made the right choice, and that sometimes, a simple act of honesty can change everything. If you found a lost watch, what would you do? If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.